This video is brought to you by Patreon. Patreon. A diamond is forever. You know, there's a lot of things you could describe Nickelodeon as, but Risk Taker really isn't one of them. From the beginning, Nickelodeon has been about careful study and consideration. Jerry Laybourne did extensive focus group research during her tenure to find out what children wanted. The original Nicktoons were chosen and developed through a long process of vetting and care. When it recently became time to find a new president for the channel, Viacom was like, hey, let's get that guy who worked on some of our most successful shows during our most successful period. And the early Cy Schneider years were no exception to this. Schneider took a look at models of children's television that had worked in the past, PBS, Disney, and built off of those, either by creating new programs in line with those models or in grabbing whatever pre-existing shows they could, even from PBS itself, like Studio C, which, side note, also ended its Nickelodeon run in 1983. I forgot to mention that in the last video, sorry. This mindset even applied to Nickelodeon's biggest outlier. You can't do that on television. It wasn't really a show that fit in with the Nickelodeon that existed at the time. Jerry Laybourne was more in their corner than Schneider was, but in what few writings from him exist, Schneider justified the show's inclusion by comparing it to the successful adult skit show Laugh-In. Our needs for comedy were served by a Laugh-In type show for kids produced by Roger Price in Canada. Price's You Can't Do That on Television became one of Nickelodeon's most popular properties. Schneider came from old television, getting his start in the 1950s making toy commercials to air during the Mickey Mouse Club, and he never really left that mindset. Having Cy Schneider running the first children's cable channel, a concept that was still on the bleeding edge in 1983, is kind of like putting the guy who invented the rotary phone in charge of Android. We're not trying to take away from their accomplishments, but maybe we'd be better off with someone more forward-facing. 1983 would be Schneider's last calendar year as president of Nickelodeon, and most of his work for the channel was behind him. But he would take one more big project, one more stab at bringing the old successes of educational children's television to Nickelodeon. And this time, it would be his oldest pull yet, one that predated even his own career. Cy Schneider's swan song was to bring back Mr. Wizard.
What in the world is going on here? Mr. Wizard knows. It's candles, card tricks, computers, and more when he and the kids discover some neat things about them all. Like what makes a candle burn? It's more than you think. How can you always pick the right card and amaze your friends? Did you know you can see a hole in your hand or make your computer burst into color? Watch Mr. Wizard's World today at 6:30 Eastern, 3:30 Pacific. Mr. Wizard's World, where science is something else.
So, who is Mr. Wizard? This is Don Herbert. Born in Minnesota in 1917, Herbert had served in the Army and later the Air Force during World War II. After being discharged in 1945, he began to pursue a career in acting, first in the theater and then in radio, where in 1949 he got a gig as a field reporter for a radio show called It's Your Life, a documentary health show created for the Department of Public Health. You can actually listen to a bunch of it online. As you might expect, it's got a lot of outdated ideas. There's an episode on shock treatment that's a bit of a nightmare to listen to. But it did have multiple episodes about sex, which is something you'd not expect from the 1940s.
Tape reporter Don Herbert is talking first with one of the boys who says,
how about the other physical changes?
I have a little hair.
Yeah.
And
You're kind of ahead of the rest of the boys in your class then.
yeah, well, I'm the oldest in the class.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I am in some ways mature.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, grown man talking to a young boy about his body, get your jokes out now. But it's in moments like this, of Don Herbert creating an open line of communication with young people, that Mr. Wizard started to find his voice. It's important to know that Herbert was interested in science, but he was not a scientist. He didn't originally aim to be an educator, he was just an actor. Educational programming just sort of fell into his lap. Not long after It's Your Life, television started to gain momentum, and stations were hungry for whatever content they could get. Herbert saw an opportunity, not just to have a job in entertainment, but to be his own boss.
As an actor, you're at the whim of the director and the producer, and hired, and so on. And I've always wanted to be able to have sort of independence, to be able to do what I wanted to do.
While there were a lot of open doors in television at the time, the show would still need a source of financial backing. Enter the Cereal Institute. The Cereal Institute was a conglomerate organization of several cereal manufacturers, including Quaker Oats, General Foods, and General Mills. They were looking for an educational kind of package so that they could put what they called a breakfast story in the middle of it. Eat a good breakfast of fruit, cereal, milk, bread, and butter, or other foods of variety like eggs or breakfast meats. They made a deal with NBC. NBC furnished the time, and the Cereal Institute paid for the facilities and the package. And that's how it finally got on the air, as a public affairs program in effect.
Doctors found in a series of tests on college boys and girls of a big Midwest medical school that when you've had a good cereal breakfast, like that one over there, for instance, you're able to work better, you're a lot keener and sharper, and your muscles won't get so tired, especially during the late morning hours.
And that's why it's smart to start every day with a good breakfast of
fruit, cereal, milk, bread, and butter. Right.
Hey, did you know that the idea of breakfast being the most important meal of the day was invented by lobbyists to sell more cereal and bacon? The pitch Herbert made to WNBQ-TV, the Chicago outlet for NBC, was pretty genius in its simplicity. Herbert would demonstrate scientific principles, such as electricity, gravity, or chemical reactions, and then demonstrate them to a young person using mostly simple items that could either be found around the house or bought easily and cheaply, making the experiments easy to replicate at home. And then, every once in a while, talk about how great breakfast is. It was an easy-to-understand show, and it was engaging, while being very cheap to produce, so NBC picked it up, and on March 3rd, 1951, the world saw the premiere of Watch Mr. Wizard.
Watch Mr. Wizard. Now, Mr. Wizard's not his real name, but that's what all the kids in the neighborhood call him, because he shows them the magic and mystery of science in everyday living.
I was doing an audition for an advertising agency, and I had called the program Our Wonderful World or something like that. And the account executive said, "I don't like your title." He said, "Why don't you call it Wizard?" I said, "Well, I don't like that because that implies a tall hat with stars and moons on it, and so forth, and an old codger." And then I remembered there was a program called Mr. Imagination, and I liked the idea of adding Mr. So I came up with the idea of calling it Mr. Wizard, which would take away from the stars and moons on his hat.
Watch Mr. Wizard was broadcast live in certain areas, as many as 14 stations, with kinescope recordings, which in the simplest terms is a film camera recording a television monitor. This was years before we figured out video. Those recordings were broadcast to as many as 77 NBC stations across the country. It wasn't the only science affairs show to air during that time. Watch Mr. Wizard aired with contemporaries like John Hopkins' Science Review, Zoo Parade, and What in the World, but it outlasted all of those programs by a wide margin. It's important to remember that educational children's television was a brand spanking new idea. We're still 17 years before Mr. Rogers. We're 4 years before Captain Kangaroo. So there wasn't any guidebook on how to pull it off. Don Herbert made a number of decisions that really helped with Watch Mr. Wizard's appeal. First off, the show was not strictly scripted, but was rehearsed once or twice beforehand. This allowed the 3-camera setup to work out their moves and cuts, and to make sure that the show moved at a good pace, but not having a script kept the interactions between Mr. Wizard and his child sidekick feeling natural and improvisational.
Can you tell me 6 different ways to make electricity?
I think I know 4.
All right.
Well, there's light.
Yes.
And there's sound.
Oh, wait a minute, wait. What do you mean by sound?
Vibration. When you speak into something and then it's...
Oh, into a microphone, a little electric... Oh, I see. Well, now, wait a minute. All you're doing there is you're changing the vibrations of your voice into an electrical signal, but I want to know what is it that changes it? Where do the little electrons that come out of the microphone come from?
Gadget.
SO cross off.
Okay, SO's off.
Light, you understand? There's something inside that does it. All right.
We had auditions for kids and tried a whole series of standard experiments on each of them. We did maybe 4 demonstrations. We saw how they would react because we didn't have a script for them. They were ad-libbing along with me. That meant we had to have kids who were confident, presentable, intelligent enough to be able to figure out stuff and have fun. And once we found them, we hung on to them for dear life because they were very, very important to the show. The minimum age was 11 and the maximum age was 13. That's the same age as Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, 4-H clubs, and so forth. That's when kids are really exploring their world and trying to find out what goes on around them. Younger than that, they don't have quite enough information to be able to solve problems, and older than that, they begin to worry about their peers. That age group, it doesn't make too much difference if they don't know because they're not expected to know everything. The sets were designed to look like normal garages, workshops, and kitchens. There was no attempt at fancy science fiction labs or, name be damned, some kind of wizard's lair. Herbert wanted to keep a natural setting. Science wasn't something to be kept at arm's length to children, not to be just the realm of adults. The setting and simple household items used in the experiments meant that young people could play around with these scientific principles themselves. To call Watch Mr. Wizard a success would be an understatement. It rose to 3rd place in ratings in just 4 months. It won a Peabody Award in 1953, but most telling was the Mr. Wizard's fan clubs. There were a lot of them, as many as 5,000 by 1954, with an estimated membership of 100,000. Watch Mr. Wizard was a phenomenon, plain and simple. The Serial Institute dropped their sponsorship around 1955, but NBC knew they had a hit, so they moved production to New York City and kept it going for another 10 years. The final episode airing on June 27, 1965. 14 years, 547 episodes. And that wasn't the only thing Don Herbert was involved with during that time. There was General Electric Theater, an anthology show hosted by Ronald Reagan. During breaks in the story, Herbert hosted segments where he would demonstrate some of the neat innovations that were being dreamt up in the General Electric's laboratories.
Now, the things we've shown you are from General Electric's House of Magic show, which many of you may have seen. Of course, there's nothing magical about them. They're all based on sound scientific fact and research. The sort of research that leads to progress. And at General Electric, progress is our most important product.
And while Watch Mr. Wizard may have been over, Don Herbert never found himself out of work, typically producing his own projects, producing shows for public television and classroom viewings through the 60s and 70s, including a quick 1-season revival of Mr. Wizard in 1971. Mr. Wizard remained in the public eye as an authority on science and technology, doing commercial work for companies like Pioneer, explaining just how these newfangled Laserdisc machines work.
The greater number of lines, the greater the resolution. And Pioneer offers more lines, far more resolution than any other home video system. As unbelievable as it seems, 40% higher resolution than a home video cassette player.
Not to mention a number of talk show appearances, where he gave the same kind of science demonstrations that made him popular in the 50s. He was even a guest on the very first episode of Late Night with David Letterman in 1982.
Okay. This is modern insulation. And I'll pat it down so there's about... Here, kitty, 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 kitty. There's about an inch or so of insulation above your hand. I'll put the quarter on the top. Now, whatever you do, don't move that hand. Because here comes the blowtorch.
And all of this kept Mr. Wizard a household name nearly 2 decades after the show went off the air. Which brings us to the early 80s, with Herbert looking for his next project. The 1971 revival of Mr. Wizard didn't really work because it wasn't very different from the 50s version. The same leisurely pace, 2-camera, 1-take setup, it had become an old-fashioned model of television. If Mr. Wizard was to come back in the 80s, it would need some adjustment. So with the help of his wife, Norma Castle, Herbert put together a pilot for a new Mr. Wizard show. He wasn't terribly pleased with the results.
Once we finished the pilot and took a look at it, I was unhappy with it. Primarily because the children were not very... I was so accustomed to ad-libbing with its children in the old Mr. Wizard show that I hesitated to give the new kids actual lines to say. And as a result, it was not very, very satisfactory. So we told the production company, forget it. You know, we don't like it. It's not good enough. And and one of the salesmen dropped off a pilot at Nickelodeon. And one of the program managers at Nickelodeon called and said he'd seen the program. I said, "You're not supposed to be looking at it. You don't like it." He said, "No, I understand what you were driving at, and I think it'll work." He said, "You think it'll work?" He said, "Yes, I certainly do." So we made a deal with them, and we finally did a series of 26.
That program manager was, of course, Cy Schneider. Now, naturally, the idea of a new Mr. Wizard show would appeal to Schneider. It was based on a very successful older model of children's television, one of the oldest models possible, in fact. If you wanted to have a throwback to an even older kids show, you'd have to get the rights to Howdy Doody. Watch Mr. Wizard was also a contemporary to Schneider's work in television. This was exactly Schneider's jam. We brought Mr. Wizard back to television. Don Herbert had his Mr. Wizard science show for children on NBC for 16 years. We found Don active and busy with science projects in California and developed a new 1980s format for him to perform his famous experiments on the air again. But outside of this project being Cy Schneider catnip, it was also a pretty smart acquisition. We've talked before about how Nickelodeon originally leaned on a weird 1910s aesthetic of kinetoscopes and player piano music, which almost certainly had little appeal to the target demographic of children's television, which were baby boomers who had just started families of their own. And while the kinetoscope turned into the silver ball and the advertising became more modern, Nickelodeon didn't have that baby boomer nostalgia hook, that thing that would make people in their 20s and 30s go, "Oh, like television I watched as a kid." Nickelodeon revived Mr. Wizard in 1983 for much the same reason Nickelodeon is in the process of reviving all that right now, so that cable purchasing adults can go, "Oh, I remember that from my childhood. I bet my kid will love it too." Which of course says nothing about the quality of the actual show. So, Mr. Wizard's World. What did it do, and how well did it do it?
Okay, now bring the paper down slowly over the top of the candle flame, and this is what plain flash paper without any chemicals in it is like.
Whoa!
Nice yellow flame, right?
Yeah, that's
Notice
neat.
it completely disappeared?
Yeah.
Okay, well now I soaked some of the chemicals that you and I just put in that dish. I soaked the pieces of flash paper in it, and you should now get a different color. Here, this one is copper chlorate.
Okay.
Hold it over the top and see what you get.
Oh, it's blue.
Nice blue
Whoa.
color, right. You see why I'm careful about all this? Because you have lots of fire.
Mr. Wizard's World jettisoned the idea of each episode having a theme, and instead put together short 2 or 3 minute segments with random Mr. Wizard experiments. You could edit these segments into any order. It didn't matter. Just add them up to a half hour and call it a day.
Oh, neat.
Okay. Now, here is a candle on the end of a nice long stick.
Oh, no. I think I know what we're going to do.
You do? What?
We're going to get the heat from the candle close to the balloon and it's going to blow up
Yes,
into water.
That's right. And we're going to make the tiniest, tiniest little drop of water. Are you ready?
I think so.
Okay, go ahead. Go up there, touch the balloon. There you go.
These segments would come with titles like Everyday Magic, Supermarket Science, or How It Works. Now that we're in the 80s, more recent technological innovations were worked into the show, like computers and video games and other electronics, but the bread and butter of the show remains simple experiments that could be replicated at home, along with the odd explosion. There were also segments of nature footage, computer simulations, or other interesting science-related footage that Mr. Wizard narrated over.
Here's a frontier in imagery. This is an outline of a supersonic airplane, but not a real one. It's a mathematical model of a plane that was fed into a computer, along with the calculated stresses on the surfaces indicated by the various colors. With the computer controls, the model can be rotated and flexed to see what happens to the stress. The changing colors give the designers of the plane an indication of how it should be engineered to
to withstand the forces encountered when it's flying faster than the speed of sound.
Now, the short nature of the experiments, condensed into heavily edited clips, meant the relationship between Mr. Wizard and the kids played off a bit differently. In Watch Mr. Wizard, the two of them having a full half hour together allowed them to build a rapport and develop a narrative over the episode. You also felt like you were getting to know these kids. In Mr. Wizard's world, the short length of the experiments and the constant rotation with 5 or 6 kids per episode kept them feeling pretty anonymous and apart from the viewers. Don Herbert felt this version a downgrade as well, calling these kids stock company children.
In this case, we have a whole series of sort of stock companies of children, probably a total of 20 altogether, but 10 of them were the standard that did most of the programming. Here's one of our standard stock company gals who is working with a special demonstration which we put together explaining electricity.
How do we use electrons?
Well, in microwaves.
Right, microwave.
Blenders.
Right. Anything you plug into the wall, right. TV, toasters, all that stuff. Well, that's what this bell represents, okay.
Mr. Wizard's World was shot in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, with a 26-episode order. When it came time to option for a second season, Cy Schneider had left the channel, and Jerry Laybourne was in the process of becoming president of Nickelodeon. Thankfully, Mr. Wizard's World was one Schneider-era show that Laybourne could get behind.
Geraldine Laybourne took over as president of Nickelodeon and contacted us to do a total of 78 altogether. And so we finished the rest of them up.
Newton taught us about gravity. Einstein taught us about time. Now, Mr. Wizard teaches us how to launch the soda bottle, operate a hypnodisc, and blow up 2 balloons at once with all new experiments. He'll show you how to make clouds, invent codes, run backwards, and explore the wonders of nature.
And you sucked up a little fish?
It's new tricks, new gizmos, even new sweaters. Mr. Wizard's World, weekdays at 7, 6 Central, only on Nickelodeon.
Mr. Wizard's World found immense success on a channel that desperately needed it, and would continue producing new episodes all the way to 1990, with reruns continuing for another decade, first as a part of Nick at Night until about 1995, then in the early morning hours of Nickelodeon until the year 2000. That is a super long time to be on Nickelodeon. In fact, if you count reruns, Mr. Wizard's World is in the top 10 longest running Nick shows. It's the only Schneider-era show to make it to 1992, let alone 2000. And yes, it's a good show. It's a simple show, and that was the key to its longevity. Perhaps not as impactful as its 1950s counterpart, but it breathed new life into the Mr. Wizard brand, bringing replicatable science experiments and ideas into the home of cable viewers across the United States, and making Don Herbert the face of science for a new generation of young people. And the impact of both versions of Mr. Wizard is undeniable. It was these programs that gave us that popular image of the adult scientist and the young sidekick, like Mr. Peabody and Sherman, or Doc Brown and Marty McFly. And Mr. Wizard would be referenced and parodied until, well, today.
Well, Jeff, what say today we learn how pulleys and levers work?
Aw, gee, Mr. Wizard, I was hoping you'd teach us how to make plastic explosives with household detergents.
Gee, Mr. Lizard, what should I do with the nitroglycerin?
We're gonna need another Timmy. Well, Timmy, you just pour it into the blender there while I get behind this lead shield.
Okay.
Say it. We're gonna need another Timmy.
And of course, there were the science shows that Mr. Wizard helped inspire, like Beakman's World, which paid tribute to Mr. Wizard by naming their 2 penguin characters Don and Herb. And there was Bill Nye, the science guy, Nye having watched the show as a child.
So I watched Mr. Wizard diligently. It was not on regularly. Like, there was something, you couldn't count on it every week. I remember this was troublesome. And then later in life, I watched his I guess the expression is remake of his old shows that was made in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, I think. And then I had lunch with him eventually, and that was quite cool. It was great. It was wonderful. And his wife, Fern, said Don, his name's Don Herbert, was very happy to have somebody to whom he could pass the torch. That was quite gratifying.
Mr. Wizard was the original. Even Bill Nye was at his funeral and paid homage to him. Bill said Don was the one that influenced all of us. When Don spoke at the National Science Teachers Association at the annual meeting in Anaheim 06, the Mythbusters were performing, and when they got up, they announced Don was in the audience. 600 people all stood up and gave him a 5-minute applause. The Mythbusters admitted he influenced everyone. Who would dispute that? He was America's favorite science teacher.
What do you think is television's responsibility to education?
None. Why would television have any responsibility for education?
Most of the interviews I've seen from Don Herbert were from late in his life, in his 80s, and the impression they leave me with is someone not terribly happy about their legacy. Don Herbert wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a professional educator. He was a struggling actor who found his way into a gig off the back of cereal lobbyists that would typecast him for the rest of his life. While figures like Bill Nye lovingly cited him as an influence, that love only went one way. Both Bill Nye and Beakman's World, it's a different approach entirely. A lot of fast cuts and a lot of attempts at comedy. A lot of creativity has gone into the shows, but they're not engaging the kids at home, I don't think. They're working directly to camera, so they don't have anybody to bounce ideas off of. They don't have any sort of cooperation from the child. That's why most people don't realize how important the child was on Mr. Wizard. They were the surrogate audience. And when the child was posed a problem, the child at home was posed a problem. When the child came up with an answer, the child at home either agreed or disagreed. I don't personally agree with that. I was watching all 3 of these shows at the same time. Reruns of Mr. Wizard's World, Beakman's World, and Bill Nye the Science Guy, and while I remember all of those shows fondly, the visual creativity of the latter 2 shows stuck with me more. I do believe I learned more from Bill Nye and Beakman. Your mileage may vary, of course, but I never felt I needed an audience surrogate for educational programming because, I was the audience. Why would I need a surrogate when I'm already there? But maybe Don Herbert wasn't interested in direct engagement with the audience.
Well, most of the fan mail we get is from kids who want something. Dear Mr. Wizard, please send me everything you have on electricity. And keep sending it until I tell you to stop. What is it that the actors spit and it blows up? And if you've got any, please send me some. Mostly they want something.
Don Herbert passed away in 2007, a few weeks shy of his 90th birthday. It's not my place to say how he should have felt about his legacy. I'm sad if he felt discouraged by it at the end of his life. But Mr. Wizard will certainly live on for a long time. Select episodes of Watch Mr. Wizard and Mr. Wizard's World are available on DVD, and there is an official Mr. Wizard YouTube channel where you can watch dozens of segments of Mr. Wizard's World. It's not a hard show to go back to revisit, and it continues to influence science television to this day. Mythbusters Jr., which premiered this year, is the closest thing we've gotten to a Mr. Wizard format in a long time, with Adam Savage serving the supervising adult role, helping young people perform experiments. Don Herbert is an impressively important figure in American television, and Mr. Wizard's World was a steady and reliable program for Nickelodeon for nearly 2 decades. Even if the show doesn't move at everyone's speed, it's impressive nonetheless. Now, if you'll excuse me, I feel like making a baking soda and vinegar volcano.
Nick, 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 Nickelodeon. Nick, 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 Nickelodeon.
Next time, we close up Nickelodeon 1983 with spooky cereals. No, I don't mean Boo Berry, not that kind of cereal. Oh, never mind. Today's reference shout-out goes to Science on American Television, A History by Marcel C. La Follette, I think. There's a lot here about the history of educational science television, which you can imagine Mr. Wizard played a big part of. It's a good read, though unfortunately only available as an ebook and at college textbook prices, which, I mean, that's just a contradiction. You're not printing anything up. Why is the digital file $50? Thank you all for watching. If you'd like to support Knacks and help me buy textbooks instead of pirating them, perhaps consider contributing to my Patreon. Every dollar goes to keeping the lights on and updating the production values for the show. You can also support the Pop-Arena by liking the video, subscribing, hitting that bell icon, following me on Twitter at @pop_arena, and sharing Knacks with all of your Nickelodeon-loving friends. Hey, it was Nickelodeon's 40th birthday a little while ago. The perfect time to share the channel's legacy. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.